Welcome. This webinar will go over the process for districts with an approved Step 1 system application and how they can continuously improve by making expansions, changes, or other modifications such as spending to their local designation system. First, we will go into what this webinar will cover. This webinar will cover those that are looking to expand their system by adding new teaching categories or potentially changing who is in their teaching categories or in their system. Essentially, if anyone is looking to change the who that is in their system, this webinar will cover that information. Others may want to add new or updated measures in how they evaluate teachers in terms of teacher observation and student growth. Essentially, anyone who wants to change the how they evaluate the teachers in their system, this webinar will cover that information as well. Finally, others may want to make changes such as spending modifications. If one or more of these applies to your district, please continue to view this webinar. To reiterate, this webinar applies to all districts with an approved Step 1 system application. If you do not have an approved Step 1 system application, you should download the new Cohort E application from our website. This webinar applies to districts with a Step 1 system application that has been approved in cohorts A, B, C, or D. To review the timeline, districts will be applying to make expansions, changes, or modifications to their system that will be implemented in school year 2022-2023. The application will be due April 15th, and TEA will review it with an opportunity for districts to resubmit. If approved, the submitted expansions, changes, or modifications will be added to a district's existing system in 2022-2023. Districts can then implement the system in 2022-2023 and submit data and designation recommendations by November 1st, 2023. Some of you may be wondering how expansions, changes, or modifications will impact a district's local designation system approval. This will not impact a district's local designation system approval, and it will not extend the renewal timeline. The renewal process, which will be completed in the 5th year of approval, will allow districts to consider their system holistically and ensure continued compliance with TIA standards. More information about the renewal process will be available later this year. Others may be wondering if expanding, changing, or modifying their system will require a new initial data capture year. The answer is no. Districts are not required to submit data for all teachers and eligible teaching assignments after their first successful data capture year. The purpose of the application approval is to encourage continuous improvement of districts for their local designation system. The purpose is also to ensure that the proposed system meets statutory and administrative requirements in terms of student growth, teacher observation, and spending. And finally, the purpose is to ensure that there's clear communication of the proposed changes in the system. The types of expansions, changes, and modifications will basically cover who is part of the system, how they are measured, and other system changes such as spending. Not all expansions, changes, or modifications will require an application. So let's dive into more specifics. In the top row, we are talking about who is in the system. And so largely, if you are adding, changing, or removing who is part of your system, an expansions modification application is required. In the middle row, we will talk about how these teachers are being evaluated. Largely, if you are changing the teacher observation rubric or using a new one, changing the assessment that will be used, changing the growth measure that will be used, or removing a growth measure, an expansions modification application will be required. However, if you are just adding, removing, or changing the optional components, changing the weighting, changing how expected growth is set, or changing your district's performance standards, no application is required. At the bottom, if you are adding additional campuses, so for example, if your district decided to start with a small group of campuses, and now you would want to expand to others, you would require an application. However, if your district already had all campuses eligible and you're just simply adding new campuses to your district, no application is required. In addition, at the bottom, if you're changing your district spending plan, such as your 90-10, how and when your teacher will receive the funds, an application will be required. The only part of spending that will not require an application is if there are changes to the stakeholder engagement portion of the spending plan. To start off, your district should first look at your approved weighting tab. This weighting tab is an example from Cohort D, so your weighting tab may look slightly different. In this example, this district is approved for one teacher category that is comprised of multiple teaching assignments, including 3-5 math, 3-5 reading, and 3-5 science. They are all in the same teacher category because they are all being evaluated using the same components, including the same assessment and the same weighting. In terms of who is part of your system, a district would need to submit an expansions modifications application if they wanted to add another teaching category or a teacher category 2 in this case. They would also need to submit an expansions modifications application if they wanted to add, say, 6th grade math to category 1 using the exact same approved components. Additionally, let's say they wanted to remove maybe 5th grade science from category 1, that would also require an expansions modifications application. Now let's dive into how teachers are evaluated. Largely, if there are changes to the growth measure, the teacher observation rubric, or the assessment used, an expansions modification application will be required. In this example, changing the rubric, let's say they wanted to move from t-test to another rubric, an application would be required. Or if they wanted to use SLOs, or they wanted to switch from Renaissance Star to, say, another assessment, an application would be required. In this example, changing teacher leadership or other portions of the additional system components, an application will not be required. Also, changing the weighting would not require a new application or an expansions modifications application. This leads us into another frequently asked question. Since how you set the growth goal does not require an expansions modifications application, if your district had previously been using district created goals for NWEA math biology, and now you want to start using the goals set by MAP in 22-23, your district would not need to submit an expansions modifications application. Finally, we will review other system or statutory changes. If you are a district where you started with a small group of campuses and now you want to expand to more, an expansions modifications application is required. If your district already had all campuses eligible and now you're just simply adding on campuses as your district expands, no application is required. Also, if you're changing your district spending plan in terms of the 90-10, how and when teachers are receiving funds, and in what mode they are receiving funds, an application will be required. Only if changes to the stakeholder engagement around the spending plan change is no application required. So if you look at the spending tab of your application, it's usually Part B of the Cohort D application that would not be required if there are changes, and or in cohorts A to C, it was Part B, number 3. To come back to the purpose of the expansions modification application is to provide ways for districts to continuously improve while ensuring that the system meets statutory and administrative requirements, and also that there's clear communication of a district's local designation system. There are 7 steps in completing the expansions modifications application. The first step is to go to our website. On our website, if you go to the local designation tab and you scroll down to step 1 system application, the expansions modification system application will be populated in the resources section. Districts will need to download the expansions modification system application as well as the TIA Cohort E system application attestations. Once downloaded, this is what districts will see in terms of the application. Largely, this looks like previous applications that districts have had to complete for system approval. First, please review the directions for completing the application. Next, districts will need to complete the district information tab. And then the most important tab is going to be the Expansion Modifications Form tab. In this tab, districts will detail the changes or expansions or modifications that districts would like to make for 2022-2023. This tab will also determine what additional information is required based on the change that is proposed. The first 5 questions on this tab ask the districts to describe the proposed change for 2022-2023 in the stakeholder engagement that was conducted to make this change. Questions 6 through 12 will require the district to mark yes or no to the change. Once a district selects yes or no, the required tabs to complete will populate. Based on many conversations with districts, there may be some more commonly requested changes. For example, many of you will be adding new teaching assignments with new student growth measures. If this applies to you, please mark yes for number 6. Then also mark yes for number 12, because you will be adding a new growth measure. And then based on the growth measure you would like to use, select the growth measure that you would like to add. As you can see, as you populate yes or no, different things to complete will populate on the right-hand side. A summary of the changes of what a district will need to complete will be provided at the bottom of the page. So for example, if you are trying to add new eligible teaching assignments using SLOs, which was not previously approved, you will need to upload an updated version of your previously approved weighting tab and also complete the SLO tab in this expansions modifications application. Once you go to the SLO tab, you will see that it says full tab must be completed for submission. This will indicate whether or not a district will need to complete that tab or not. For example, if you go to portfolio, that indicator is not there and this tab will not need to be populated. Based on conversations, some districts may also want to modify their existing spending plan in terms of the 90-10, the how and when a district will pay their teachers, additionally, how they plan to compensate their previously designated teachers or national board teachers. If this is the case, please go ahead and mark yes, and then you will need to make changes to the appropriate spending tab. And so the full tab must be completed for submission. As you can see, if a district wants to make multiple changes, the multiple changes may require multiple tabs to be completed. The final step will be to submit the expansions modifications application by April 15, 2022. You may have noticed that the other student growth measure is not a tab on this expansions modifications application. That is because the other student growth measure has been merged into pre-test, post-test options in terms of who creates the pre-test, who sets the growth target, and who creates the post-test. Your district will not need to determine if the other student growth measure is changing to a pre-test, post-test. You will only need to determine if the assessment itself is changing. So there are 2 specific steps for the pre-test, post-test tab. First, you will need to complete part A, including who creates the pre-test, who sets the growth goals, and who creates the post-test. That will then determine what questions in part B need to be answered by the district. So for example, on the pre-test, post-test tab, you will need to complete the eligible teacher category description. Then say you're using a previous year star result. Then let's say that you are using a district created growth goal, and then you are then using the end of year star result. You will populate the pretest, the growth target, and then the post-test. And then if you scroll down to part B, it will tell you which option and which questions to complete. So for this example, only the questions under option 2 will need to be completed. Thank you for watching this webinar. And if you have changes that do not fall into these particular buckets, or if you have additional questions, please contact TIA@tea.texas.gov.